The temperature was 14 degrees below zero on the morning of January 10th, 1891, when Henrik Sandström walked outside his barn and did not immediately freeze. Across the settlement, 6 families were burning furniture. The Morrisons had already lost 3 chickens to the cold inside their home. The birds simply stopped moving, their bodies rigid on the kitchen floor by dawn. Martha Morrison held her youngest child against her chest beneath 2 quilts and a canvas tarp, breathing warm air onto the child's face every few minutes, because the stove, even when fed continuously, could not raise the temperature inside their cabin above 32 degrees. The Carvers had retreated to a single room. They stuffed rags into every crack, hung blankets over the windows, and took turns feeding the fire through the night. By morning, Thomas Carver's hands were blistered from handling frozen wood, and his wife had not slept in 40 hours. The wind had been blowing without pause for 6 days. It came from the northwest, steady and mechanical, forcing its way through clapboard walls, around door frames, beneath shingles. It found every weakness. It turned homes into sieves. Henrik Sandström walked from his cabin to his workshop that morning wearing a single coat. He did not run. He did not hunch against the wind. When he returned an hour later with a handsaw and a box of nails, his daughter Anna met him at the door. She was holding a cup of warm oatmeal. The kitchen behind her was filled with light from the kerosene lamp, and the air was warm enough that condensation formed on the inside of the window glass. 14 degrees below zero outside. 61 degrees inside the kitchen? No one had believed it would work. They said he was building a monument to his own foolishness. They said he was wasting timber and time and the last of his money on a structure that made no sense. They said a barn belongs in a field, not wrapped around a house like a shell around an egg. They said Henrik Sandström was a carpenter who had forgotten how to think. They were wrong. 9 months earlier, in April of 1890, Henrik Sandström stood in front of the unfinished cabin he had spent 2 years building and made a decision that would define the next decade of his life. The cabin was small, 16 feet by 20 feet. Timber frame, clapboard siding, shake roof. It had cost him $240 in materials and 5 months of labor. It had a stone fireplace, 2 windows with glass panes, and a door that fit square in its frame. By the standards of Dakota Territory in 1890, it was a solid, respectable home. It was also going to kill his family. Henrik knew this because he had survived the winter of 1887 in a cabin almost identical to this one. That winter, the temperature had fallen to 31 below zero for 8 consecutive days in January. He and his first wife, Ingrid, had burned every piece of furniture they could spare. They slept in their coats. They melted snow for water because the well was frozen solid, and the effort of carrying it inside and heating it took more energy than the water provided. Ingrid died in February, not from cold directly, but from pneumonia that began as a cough in late January and became a fever by the first week of February. The cabin had been 40 degrees inside for 3 weeks straight. No amount of fire could raise it higher. The walls leaked heat faster than the stove could produce it. Henrik left Dakota Territory that spring. He returned to Minnesota, worked in a lumber mill for 2 years, remarried, and told himself he would not go back. But land was cheap in Dakota, and wages in Minnesota were not enough to raise a family. In 1889, he returned. He filed a claim. He built a cabin. He told himself this time would be different, because this time he knew what to expect. Then, in April of 1890, he stood in front of that finished cabin and realized he had built the same trap. The problem was not the cabin. The cabin was as good as any other. The problem was the wind. The wind in Dakota Territory did not gust and calm like wind in other places. It blew steadily, hour after hour, day after day, pressing against every surface, forcing cold air into every crack and seam. A cabin was a box of wood in an ocean of moving air, and no matter how tightly it was built, the air always won. Henrik had heard a story once, years earlier, from a man named Lars Johansson. Lars was a Swede who had spent 15 years in northern Finland before emigrating. He talked about something called a timmerhus I lada, a timber house inside a barn. Finnish farmers, he said, built their winter homes inside their livestock barns, not beside them. The animals generated heat. The barn walls blocked the wind. The living quarters stayed warm without burning half a forest. Henrik had dismissed it at the time. It sounded like desperation, like something people did when they were too poor to build properly. Now, standing in front of his cabin in April of 1890, he reconsidered. What if the principle was not about poverty, but about physics? What if a cabin needed a second skin? He spent 3 days thinking through the logistics. Then he ordered lumber. Thomas Carver was the first to object. Thomas was a practical man. He owned 80 acres, raised cattle, and served as the unofficial mayor of the small settlement that had grown up around Willow Creek. When Henrik explained what he intended to do, Thomas set down his hammer and stared. "You are going to build a barn around your house." "Yes," Henrik said. "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard." Thomas explained with the patience of a man correcting a child that barns were built in fields because livestock needed space and ventilation. Barns were not insulated. Barns were not airtight. Barns were designed to allow air to move through them, not to block it. Wrapping a barn around a cabin would accomplish nothing except trapping moisture, rotting the wood, and costing a small fortune in lumber. "You will spend $300 to make your house colder," Thomas said. "I guarantee it." Henrik did not argue. He thanked Thomas for his time and continued ordering materials. The second objection came from Reverend Pike. Reverend Pike was not a minister in any formal sense, but he had a Bible and a strong opinion about the proper way to live, which in Dakota Territory was enough to grant him authority. He visited Henrik's claim in early May, looked at the foundation posts Henrik had begun setting, and frowned. "A house is meant to stand in the open," he said. "A house is meant to face the world directly. Hiding it inside another structure is unnatural. It suggests shame. It suggests fear." Henrik, who was not a religious man but understood the value of avoiding unnecessary enemies, nodded politely and said nothing. The third objection came from a man named Samuel Fairchild. Samuel Fairchild was a civil engineer from Pennsylvania who had come west to survey rail lines. He had studied architecture at a technical college and considered himself an authority on building science. When he heard what Henrik was planning, he rode out to the claim specifically to explain why it would fail. "You are creating a convection trap," Samuel said. "Warm air from your cabin will rise into the barn space. Cold air will sink back down. You will establish a shunhuan, a cycle that will pull heat out of your living space faster than your stove can replace it. Worse, moisture from cooking and breathing will condense on the cold barn walls and drip back down onto your roof, rotting the shingles and ceiling boards within 2 years." He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He cited principles of thermodynamics. He explained in detail why Henrik's plan violated basic engineering. Henrik listened. Then he said, "I appreciate your concern." Samuel shook his head. "You are wasting your time and your money. When this fails, do not say you were not warned." Henrik began construction in mid-May. The first step was to build a timber frame large enough to enclose the cabin with at least 6 feet of clearance on all sides. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet. The barn frame would measure 30 by 36 feet. That meant the barn would extend 7 feet beyond the cabin on the east and west sides, and 8 feet beyond the front and back. He set foundation posts every 8 feet, digging down 3 feet and packing gravel around the base. He used 12-inch square posts, cottonwood, treated with linseed oil. The posts alone took 2 weeks. The frame went up in June. He used 8 by 8 beams for the primary structure, joined with mortise and tenon, pinned with oak dowels. He worked alone most days. His wife, Karin, helped when she could, but she was 6 months pregnant and could not lift heavy timber. Their daughter, Anna, who was 9 years old, carried tools and held boards steady, while Henrik nailed them in place. The work was slow. A timber frame barn, properly built, required precision. Every joint had to fit tightly. Every beam had to be plumb and square. Henrik had built barns before, but never one like this. Never one designed to function as a thermal envelope rather than a simple shelter for animals and equipment. By late June, the frame was complete. He began applying siding. This was where the mockery became public. The settlement around Willow Creek was small, fewer than 30 families, but word traveled quickly. People rode past Henrik's claim to see the strange construction. They stopped. They stared. They asked questions. "What are you building?" "A barn," Henrik said. "Over your house?" "Yes." "Why?" "To block the wind." They laughed. Not cruelly, but with the easy condescension of people who believe they are watching someone make an obvious mistake. Martha Morrison said it looked like Henrik was trying to bury his cabin alive. Thomas Carver said it looked like a chicken coop designed by a man who had never seen a chicken. Reverend Pike said it looked like a man hiding from God's creation. Samuel Fairchild returned in July and stood silently for 10 minutes, watching Henrik nail clapboard siding to the barn frame. Then he said, "You are sealing your family's tomb." Henrik did not respond. He drove another nail, then another. The principle was simple. A cabin in open air loses heat in 3 ways. First, conduction. Heat moves through the walls, from warm interior to cold exterior, at a rate determined by the thickness and density of the material. Wood is a poor conductor, but it is not a perfect insulator. A 1-inch plank of pine loses approximately 2 British thermal units per hour per square foot for every degree of temperature difference. A cabin with 200 square feet of wall surface in air that is 30 degrees colder inside than outside loses 12,000 BTUs per hour through conduction alone. Second, convection. Air moving across the exterior surface of a wall carries heat away faster than still air. Wind at 15 miles per hour increases heat loss by approximately 40%. In Dakota Territory, where wind speeds routinely exceeded 20 miles per hour for days at a time, convection losses could double or triple the baseline. Third, infiltration. Air leaks through cracks, gaps, and seams. Even a well-built cabin exchanges its entire interior air volume every 2 to 3 hours. Every cubic foot of cold air that enters must be heated from outside temperature to inside temperature, and every cubic foot of warm air that escapes carries its heat with it. A cabin in open wind, heated by a wood stove producing 30,000 BTUs per hour, could barely maintain a 40-degree interior temperature when the outside air was 0 degrees. A barn wrapped around that cabin changed the equation. The barn walls blocked the wind. Convection losses dropped by 60%. The air gap between the cabin and barn created a buffer zone. Outside, air entered the barn at 0 degrees, but by the time it reached the cabin walls, it had warmed to 15 or 20 degrees, heated slightly by the cabin's radiant warmth and insulated from the full force of the exterior cold. Conduction losses dropped by 30%. The barn structure reduced infiltration. The cabin no longer faced direct wind pressure. Air leaks slowed. Interior air exchange dropped from every 2 hours to every 5 or 6 hours. The same stove, producing the same 30,000 BTUs per hour, could now maintain a 60-degree interior temperature. Henrik did not know the formulas. He had never studied thermodynamics, but he understood the principle. A cabin alone was a leaf in a storm. A cabin inside a barn was a seed inside a shell. If you subscribe to the idea that practical wisdom matters more than credentials or theory, consider subscribing now. The people who survive are often the ones who act on what they observe, not what they are told. By August, The barn was finished. It had a roof of split cedar shakes, overlapped and sealed with tar. It had walls of rough-cut pine clapboard, nailed horizontally with a half-inch overlap. It had a wide door on the south side, tall enough to drive a wagon through, and two smaller doors on the east and west sides for daily access. Inside the barn, the cabin sat like a house inside a cathedral. Henrik had left 6 feet of clearance on the east and west, 8 feet on the north, and 10 feet on the south, where he planned to store firewood and tools. The barn's interior volume was approximately 20,000 cubic feet. The cabin occupied just over 5,000. He built a small workshop in the northwest corner. He built a chicken coop along the east wall. He stacked firewood against the north wall, enough to last through the winter. When it was finished, Karin walked through the barn slowly, running her hand along the cabin's exterior wall, looking up at the barn's peaked roof high above. She did not say much. She was not given to excessive commentary. But Henrik saw her face, and he knew she understood. Anna asked if they were going to live in a barn now. No, Henrik said. We are going to live in a house that is protected by a barn. Anna thought about this. Then she said, Will it be warm? Yes, Henrik said. It will be warm. The first cold snap came in November. It was not severe. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees overnight and stayed there for 3 days. The wind picked up, steady from the northwest at 12 to 15 miles per hour. Inside the cabin, the stove burned at its usual rate. The interior temperature held at 64 degrees. Henrik walked outside into the barn space. The temperature there was 36 degrees. Not warm, but not brutal. The wind was absent. The air was still. He walked outside the barn, into the open. The wind hit him immediately, sharp and relentless. 18 degrees felt like 0. He walked back into the barn. The stillness felt like stepping indoors. Karin gave birth to their son, Jakob, in late November. The cabin was warm. The air was dry. The child was healthy. December was mild. January was not. The cold arrived on January 4th, 1891. It came with no warning. The temperature dropped from 22 degrees at noon to 4 degrees by sunset. By midnight, it was 8 below 0. By dawn, it was 12 below. The wind began that same night. Northwest, steady, 15 to 20 miles per hour. It did not gust. It did not calm. It simply blew, hour after hour, pressing against every structure in the settlement like a hand pushing against a door. By the second day, the temperature had dropped to 15 below 0. By the fourth day, it was 19 below. By the sixth day, it was 23 below, and the wind had not stopped. Thomas Carver burned his dining table on the 5th day. He broke it apart with an axe and fed it into the stove piece by piece. And even then, the temperature inside his cabin never rose above 35 degrees. His children slept in the same bed, huddled together beneath every blanket the family owned. His wife, Margaret, stopped cooking. The effort of standing near the stove, feeding the fire, stirring the pot, used more warmth than the food provided. The Morrisons burned their chairs. The Hendersons burned their bed frame. Families began sleeping in shifts, one person awake at all times to feed the fire, because letting it die, even for an hour, meant the interior temperature would drop below freezing, and pipes would burst, and food would freeze solid, and survival would become uncertain. Samuel Fairchild, the engineer, stuffed his cabin's windows with straw. He sealed the door with tar and cloth. He built a second interior wall from scrapboards and filled the gap with sawdust. His cabin's interior temperature held at 41 degrees, and he considered it a victory. Reverend Pike led a prayer circle on the 7th day. 11 people gathered in the Carver's cabin, packed into a single room, burning furniture and praying for warmth. The temperature inside was 37 degrees. The temperature outside was 26 below zero. Henrik Sandström burned firewood, same as always. The temperature inside his cabin was 62 degrees in the kitchen, 58 in the bedroom, 55 in the back room where Anna slept. The barn's interior temperature was 29 degrees, cold but not deadly, still but not brutal. Henrik worked in the barn every day, building shelves, repairing tools, splitting firewood. He wore a coat, but he did not wear gloves. His hands did not go numb. On the 8th day, Thomas Carver came to ask for help. He arrived in the afternoon, walking slowly across the frozen ground, his face red and raw from the wind. He knocked on the barn's south door. Henrik opened it. Thomas stepped inside and stopped. The stillness was immediate. The wind vanished. The pressure released. Thomas stood in the barn's interior, staring at the cabin that sat at the center of the space like a ship in a dry dock. He looked at the firewood stacked neatly against the wall. He looked at the workshop, the chicken coop, the tools hanging from pegs. He looked at the cabin's door, which was closed, and at the chimney, which was producing a thin stream of smoke. "You are burning less wood than I am," Thomas said. Henrik nodded. "About half, and it is warmer." "Yes." Thomas walked slowly around the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel floor. He stopped at the north wall and placed his hand on the barn's siding. Then he placed his hand on the cabin's wall. The cabin was warm to the touch. The barn was cold, but not frozen. "The barn blocks the wind," Henrik said. Thomas did not respond. He was thinking. "Warm air stays inside the cabin longer," Henrik continued. "Cold air does not press against the walls as hard. The stove does not have to work as hard to keep up." Thomas walked to the cabin's door and knocked. Karin opened it. Warm air spilled out, visible as a faint shimmer in the cold barn air. Thomas stared. Then he said, "May I come inside?" Karin stepped back. Thomas entered. Henrik followed. The interior of the cabin was warm, not hot, but genuinely warm. The kind of warmth that allowed a person to remove their coat and sit comfortably in a chair. The kind of warmth that made breathing easy. The stove burned steadily, but it was not roaring. The firebox was half full. The damper was set to medium draw. Anna sat at the table reading a book. Jacob slept in a cradle near the stove, wrapped in a single blanket. Thomas Carver stood in the center of the room and did not speak for nearly a minute. Then he said, "I told you this was the stupidest thing I had ever heard." "You did," Henrik said. "I was wrong." Word spread quickly. By the evening of the 8th day, 6 families knew. By the morning of the 9th day, the entire settlement knew. People came to see for themselves. They knocked on the barn door, stepped inside, felt the stillness, and understood. Samuel Fairchild arrived on the 9th day. He walked around the barn 3 times, inspecting the construction, measuring the clearances, examining the joints. Then he stood in the barn's interior and said, "You have created a thermal envelope." Henrik did not know the term. "The barn traps a layer of still air around the cabin," Samuel explained. "Still air is an excellent insulator. It prevents convective heat loss. The cabin radiates warmth into the barn space, but that warmth has nowhere to go. It is contained. It heats the air inside the barn, and that warmer air, in turn, reduces the temperature gradient across the cabin walls. The effect is cumulative. The longer the barn remains sealed, the more efficient the system becomes." He paused. Then he said, "I did not think it would work because I assumed the barn would act like a standard barn, with ventilation and air exchange. But you sealed it. You turned it into an insulated shell. That is not a barn. That is an outer wall," Henrik said. "I just wanted to block the wind." "You did more than that," Samuel said. "You built the most thermally efficient structure in Dakota Territory." The cold lasted 14 days. On the 10th day, the temperature dropped to 28 below zero. On the 11th day, it reached 31 below. The wind did not stop. It blew without pause, mechanical and relentless, for 13 consecutive days. 3 families abandoned their cabins and moved into the schoolhouse, where they could combine their efforts to heat a single larger space. 2 families burned every piece of non-essential wood they owned, including interior walls and floorboards. The Morrison family burned their fence posts. The Hendersons burned their porch. Henrik Sandström burned firewood from his stack at half the rate of his neighbors and kept his family at 60 degrees. On the 12th day, Thomas Carver asked if his family could shelter in the barn. Henrik said yes. The Carvers moved into the barn's south section, setting up a canvas partition and sleeping on straw pallets near the firewood stack. The barn's interior temperature was 32 degrees. It felt like luxury. Margaret Carver cried when she realized her children could sleep without coats. By the 13th day, 4 more families had asked to shelter in the barn. Henrik allowed them. The barn's interior filled with people, bedrolls, and the smell of kerosene lamps. The temperature rose to 38 degrees from the combined body heat. The cabin remained private. Henrik's family stayed inside, warm and isolated, while outside the barn, the settlement struggled to survive. The cold broke on January 18th. The wind stopped at dawn. The temperature rose to 4 degrees by noon, then 12 degrees by evening. It felt like spring. People emerged from their homes and surveyed the damage. Burst pipes, cracked foundations, roofs sagging under the weight of snow that had been compacted by 2 weeks of relentless wind. Fences blown flat. Livestock dead in shelters that had not been insulated well enough. The settlement had survived, but barely. Henrik's barn stood intact. His cabin was undamaged. His family was healthy. Over the next 3 months, 5 families rebuilt their cabins inside barn structures, following Henrik's design. They framed the barns first, then built the cabins inside, leaving 6 to 8 feet of clearance on all sides. They sealed the barn walls tightly. They insulated the roofs. They learned to think of the barn not as a separate structure, but as an outer skin. By the following winter, 12 families had adopted the design. By 1893, the double-envelope structure was standard practice in the region. Newcomers were advised to build the barn first, the cabin second. Engineers published papers describing the thermal efficiency. Architects began incorporating the principle into cold climate design. Modern builders call it a thermal envelope or a double wall system. The principle is the same. A structure within a structure. A shell within a shell. Still air as insulation. Henrik Sandström called it common sense. In 1897, Henrik sold his claim and moved his family to Minnesota. He worked as a carpenter, built homes, and never spoke much about the barn. When people asked, he said he had learned the technique from a Finnish farmer. Anna Sandström, his daughter, lived to be 83. In 1964, she was interviewed by a historian researching early settlement life in Dakota Territory. She remembered the winter of 1891, clearly. People thought my father was crazy, she said. They thought he was wasting money and time. But when the cold came, we were warm. We were always warm. The historian asked if her father had known the structure would work. Anna paused. Then she said, I think he hoped it would work. I think he built it because he could not afford to be wrong. That is the nature of survival intelligence. It is not built on certainty. It is built on observation, adaptation, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. The people who mocked Henrik Sandström did not lack intelligence, they lacked imagination. They could not see past the conventional shape of a solution. They could not imagine that a barn could be something other than a barn, that a structure could serve 2 purposes simultaneously. that the answer to an unsolvable problem might be to stop solving the problem directly and instead change the conditions around it. Henrik did not defeat the cold. He built a space where the cold could not reach. That distinction matters. History is written by those who prepare quietly and act decisively. The ones who survive are rarely the ones who were loudest or most confident. They are the ones who observed, adapted, and built solutions that others did not understand until it was too late. If you believe that kind of knowledge is worth preserving, subscribe. Share this story. The principles that saved Henrik Sandström's family in 1891 are the same principles that separate survival from suffering in every generation. The barn still stands, in a sense, not the physical structure, which was dismantled in 1923, but the idea, the principle, the knowledge that warmth is not about burning more fuel. It is about losing less heat. They mocked him for building a barn over his cabin. They were wrong.